The German shepherd's muscles tensed, a low growl vibrating from deep in his throat as the police siren wailed in the distance. Frank Wilson's arthritis-gnarled hand froze mid-air, inches from the dog's head. This wasn't just fear, it was recognition. Sarah, the shelter volunteer, dropped her clipboard, the plastic clattering against concrete as the dog's growl intensified toward a man in an expensive suit entering the back office. 3 weeks he's been here, she whispered, dropped off anonymously in the middle of the night. Frank's weathered fingers traced the partially melted military-grade ID tag on the worn collar, his mind flashing to Carol's empty chair at home. The numbers were deliberately damaged, but still partially legible beneath the scorched metal. What kind of monster would try to erase a service dog's identity? Frank muttered, his heart pounding with a familiar sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Carol died. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank Wilson stood at his living room window, watching the early morning light crawl across his modest front lawn in Oak Ridge, Georgia. At 68, his once straight posture had surrendered to gravity and time, shoulders stooped beneath the invisible weight of solitude. The house around him, a simple 2-bedroom ranch he and Carol had purchased 40 years ago, had grown too quiet, too empty since her passing 2 years prior. "Coffee's ready," he announced to no one, a habit he couldn't seem to break. The second mug he'd absent-mindedly prepared sat untouched on the kitchen counter beside Carol's favorite floral placemat. Frank lowered himself carefully into his chair, arthritic knees protesting the movement. The local newspaper lay folded beside his plate, headlines about Mayor Richard Hawkins's development project dominating the front page. "Progress comes to Oak Ridge," Frank read aloud, his voice filling the empty space where Carol's response should have been. "What do you think about that, sweetheart?" The silence that answered felt heavier each day. His daily routine had become a lifeline of sorts. Coffee at 6, breakfast at 7, a walk to manage his heart condition, then off to volunteer at the animal shelter by 9. The structure kept him upright when grief threatened to bend him double. His VA benefits and modest pension covered the basics, but left little room for emergencies or luxuries. He'd begun monitoring his thermostat with vigilance that would have impressed his former engineering colleagues. "Pills don't buy themselves," he muttered, organizing his daily medication. Heart pills, arthritis pills, blood pressure pills. Colorful reminders of a body in decline. And God knows Medicare only covers so much? Frank's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece where photographs chronicled a life well lived. Frank in his younger days, surveying a bridge construction. Frank and Carol on their wedding day. Frank receiving an award for structural engineering excellence. 40 years designing infrastructure that would outlast him. Bridges, municipal buildings, water treatment facilities, all requiring precision, integrity, and attention to detail. His phone rarely rang these days. His daughter Emily lived in Seattle, their relationship strained by old arguments neither seemed able to resolve. Their last conversation, 5 months ago, had ended in familiar silence. Frank had friends once, colleagues, neighbors, fellow veterans, but time and Carol's illness had gradually isolated him from their social circles. He pulled on his worn denim jacket, running a hand through silver hair that still maintained military neatness. His reflection showed a face mapped with lines, but eyes that remained sharp and observant, the eyes of a man trained to notice when something wasn't structurally sound. "Another day," he said to Carol's empty chair, a ritual acknowledgment of his continued existence in her absence. "Let's see what it brings." With that, Frank locked his front door and headed toward the animal shelter, unaware that the German shepherd he'd met yesterday would soon become the structural support his crumbling life so desperately needed. "He hasn't eaten properly since he arrived," Sarah explained, leading Frank through the shelter's concrete corridor. At 35, she managed the town's only animal shelter with maternal efficiency, her voice softening when she spoke about the animals. Most dogs get adopted within weeks, but this one... She gestured toward the kennel where the German Shepherd sat rigidly alert, amber eyes tracking their movement. "What's his story?" Frank asked, keeping his distance from the chain-link fence. The dog's powerful frame betrayed its military background. Lean muscle beneath a sable coat, ears perpetually attentive. Sarah shrugged, adjusting her glasses. Someone dropped him off after hours. Security camera caught a van, but no license plate. No note, no vaccination records, just this damaged collar. She lowered her voice. "He's scheduled for behavioral assessment tomorrow. Between us, it doesn't look good. He's shown aggression toward men in uniforms and reacts strangely to certain sounds." Frank nodded, recognizing trauma when he saw it. "Mind if I sit with him a while?" Sarah looked surprised but handed him a treat. "Just be careful. I'd hate to add a dog bite to your medical concerns." Alone with the German Shepherd, Frank settled onto the concrete floor outside the kennel, his joints protesting. "So," he began conversationally, "seems we both have communication issues." The dog regarded him with wary intelligence. "I'm not much for talking these days either." For 30 minutes, Frank sat in silence, occasionally offering a treat through the fence. The dog wouldn't approach but maintained unwavering attention. As Frank prepared to leave, a police siren wailed in the distance. The transformation was immediate. The dog retreated to the corner, hackles raised, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest. "Interesting," Frank murmured. Later that afternoon, Frank approached Sarah at the front desk. "I'd like to adopt him." She looked up, bewildered. "The German Shepherd? Frank, he's not suitable for a man your age. He needs rehabilitation, professional training." "I've got time and patience," Frank interrupted. "And we understand each other." Sarah's expression softened with concern. "Frank, is this about Carol? You can't replace..." "It's not about replacing anyone," he said firmly. "It's about giving someone a second chance." After signing a waiver acknowledging the dog's behavioral issues, Frank found himself driving home with a German Shepherd sitting tensely in his back seat. "I'm calling you Max," he announced. "My buddy in Vietnam was Max. Stubborn as hell, but the most loyal man I ever met." That first evening proved challenging. Max refused to enter the house, remaining on the porch until hunger overcame suspicion. He wouldn't eat while Frank watched and startled at the television's sudden sounds. When Frank tried approaching, Max retreated, maintaining careful distance. "Fair enough," Frank conceded. "We'll take it slow." At bedtime, Frank placed a blanket in the corner of the living room. "That's yours if you want it." Max remained standing, vigilant even in exhaustion. Frank left his bedroom door open, somehow knowing the dog needed escape routes to feel secure. Around 2 a.m., Frank awoke to whimpering. In the hallway, Max twitched in his sleep, paws scrabbling against imaginary threats. When Frank approached, the dog jerked awake, scrambling backward. "Just a dream, soldier," Frank said softly. "We all get those." Morning brought cautious progress. Max accepted water from Frank's hand and allowed closer proximity without retreating. While cleaning the damaged collar, Frank discovered something unusual, a hidden compartment ingeniously built into the leather, containing a folded, water-damaged fragment of paper with partial numbers. "What were you carrying, boy?" Frank murmured, examining the sequence. 7436P. Something tugged at his memory. The pattern resembled police badge numbering. After breakfast, Frank opened his laptop, searching Oak Ridge Police Department missing officer. Several results appeared, but one headline from 10 months ago caught his attention. "Detective Charles Peterson missing, evidence money unaccounted for. Further reading revealed troubling details. Peterson had disappeared while investigating corruption allegations surrounding Mayor Hawkins' development projects. Official reports suggested Peterson had absconded with evidence money, but comment sections buzzed with disbelief from community members. Frank studied a photograph of Peterson, a serious-faced man in his 40s with a military bearing. The article mentioned his background. Peterson, a decorated Marine before joining the police force, was known for his integrity and his K-9 partner, Commander. Frank glanced at Max, who watched him with unblinking focus. "Commander?" The dog's ears twitched. To test his theory, Frank found a video of a police press conference. The moment the uniform appeared on screen, Max's posture changed. Alert, focused, then increasingly agitated as Mayor Hawkins stepped to the podium. "I'll be damned," Frank whispered. He called the police department that afternoon asking about Detective Peterson's case. The dispatcher's tone chilled noticeably. "That case is closed, sir. If you have information, I can transfer you to Captain Reynolds." "No need," Frank replied, suddenly cautious. "Just an old man's curiosity." That evening, Frank examined the collar more carefully, finding tiny lettering inside. CMDR OCSO K9, Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Office K9 Unit. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed left Frank deeply unsettled. Over dinner, Frank at the table, Max watching from the doorway, he considered his options. At 68, with a heart condition and arthritis, he was hardly equipped for investigation. Yet something about the German shepherd's silent vigilance stirred a responsibility he couldn't ignore. "Your partner disappeared investigating corruption," Frank said to Max, "and someone went to great lengths to erase your identity." He thought of Carol, how she would have already been gathering evidence, making phone calls. "I'm not Carol," he sighed. "But I can't just look the other way." Max approached slowly, sniffing Frank's outstretched hand before retreating again, a small gesture of trust that felt monumental. That night, Frank removed Carol's photograph from his nightstand drawer, propping it beside his lamp. "I might be getting into something here, sweetheart," he told her smiling image. "What do you think? Am I being a foolish old man?" In the silence, he could almost hear her response. "The Frank Wilson I married never walked away from doing the right thing." Frank nodded. Decision made. Tomorrow, he would start asking questions, carefully, methodically, the way he'd approached every engineering project. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to dispose of a highly trained police dog and discredit its handler. Frank intended to discover why, regardless of the personal cost. In the hallway, Max settled with a sigh, his body positioned to watch both the front door and Frank's bedroom. Guardian and guarded, united by circumstance and growing trust. The Oak Ridge Police Department occupied a red brick building downtown, its American flag hanging limp in the humid Georgia morning. Frank parked across the street, observing the comings and goings while gathering his courage. Max sat in the passenger seat, tension evident in his rigid posture. "We're just asking questions," Frank assured him, though the dog's anxiety amplified his own misgivings. After 20 minutes of deliberation, he left Max in the air-conditioned car and crossed the street. The reception area smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. A young officer manned the front desk, barely glancing up from his computer. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'd like to speak with Detective Mitchell," Frank said, recalling the name from news articles as Peterson's partner. "Regarding?" "An old case. I might have information." The officer looked skeptical, but picked up the phone. After a brief exchange, he pointed toward a hallway. "Third door on the left." "He's got 10 minutes?" Detective Mitchell was younger than Frank expected, mid-30s with premature gray at his temples and the haunted eyes of someone who'd seen too much. His desk was obsessively organized, family photos conspicuously absent. "Mr. Wilson?" Mitchell didn't offer to shake hands. Officer said you have information about a case? Frank settled carefully into the visitor's chair. I'm interested in Charles Peterson's disappearance. Mitchell's expression hardened. That case is closed. Is it? Frank leaned forward. I recently adopted a German Shepherd from the shelter. Military-grade collar, responds to police sirens, becomes agitated at certain uniforms. The collar had CMDR engraved inside. A muscle twitched in Mitchell's jaw. Commander was Peterson's K-9 partner, reported missing with him. Well, he's not missing anymore. Someone tried to destroy his identification before dropping him at the shelter. Mitchell studied Frank with new intensity. Why are you here, Mr. Wilson? What's your interest in this? Frank considered his answer carefully. I'm retired military and civil engineering. I recognize when structural integrity has been compromised, in buildings or investigations. Careful, Mitchell warned, voice dropping. Some things in this town are better left buried, especially at your age. Is that a threat, Detective? Mitchell glanced toward the door before responding. Peterson was my friend, best cop I ever worked with. The narrative that he stole evidence money and ran, that's bull. He lowered his voice further. But questioning that narrative got me demoted and divorced. Frank nodded, understanding the subtext. What was Peterson investigating before he disappeared? Officially, nothing significant. Unofficially, irregularities in the permits for Hawkins' development project. Mitchell checked his watch. Your 10 minutes are up, Mr. Wilson. I suggest you enjoy your retirement and that dog of yours. As Frank rose, Mitchell added casually, Peterson trained Commander himself. Used a special whistle command to initiate search protocols. Their eyes met briefly. 4 short bursts, then 1 long, just trivia for a dog lover like yourself. Outside, Frank returned to his car where Max waited vigilantly. Made a new friend, he told the dog, though friend might be optimistic. That afternoon, Frank purchased a metal whistle from a sporting goods store. In his backyard, he tried Mitchell's suggested pattern. 4 short bursts, 1 long. Max's transformation was immediate, from wary companion to working dog, alert and focused, awaiting direction. Good boy, Frank whispered, a plan forming. Very good boy. The following morning, Frank drove to Westridge Apartments, the address listed in old news reports as Peterson's residence. Max grew increasingly animated as they approached, confirming Frank's suspicions. The building manager, a heavyset woman named Doris, eyed Frank suspiciously. We don't allow pets in the units. We're not staying, Frank assured her. Charles Peterson used to live here, apartment 207. Her expression softened. Poor Charlie, such a good tenant. Always fixed things himself, never complained. She studied Max. That his dog? Spitting image of Commander. You could say we're related, Frank replied carefully. I'm looking into what happened to him. Doris glanced around before lowering her voice. Between us, I never believed that nonsense about him stealing. Charlie was straight as an arrow. She hesitated. I kept some of his mail. Nothing valuable, just seemed wrong to throw it away. Want to see? In the cramped manager's office, Doris retrieved a shoebox containing envelopes and flyers. His sister came for most of his things, but these came after. Frank sorted through them, utility bills, advertisements, a newsletter from a veterans organization. At the bottom lay a county notice regarding public hearings for the Oak Ridge Heights development project, with Peterson's handwritten notes in the margins. Wetland violations and check property records pre-1980. Did he ever mention concerns about the development project? Frank asked. Doris nodded slowly. He was worried about the environmental impact. Said the soil testing reports didn't add up. The week before he disappeared, he was excited. Said he'd found something big enough to stop the whole project. She frowned. Then he was gone, and suddenly everyone was saying he'd stolen money. Never sat right with me. Thanking Doris, Frank left with the annotated notice. Outside, he allowed Max to lead, following the dog's confident path through the apartment complex to a small park behind the building. Max stopped at a particular tree, sniffing intently around its base. Frank knelt with difficulty, examining the area. Nothing seemed unusual until he noticed a weathered plastic bag tucked between roots, containing a waterproof container. Inside was a USB drive labeled simply, "Backup." "Good boy," Frank whispered, pocketing the drive. "Very good boy." That afternoon, Frank drove to the development site, 200 acres of partially cleared land where Mayor Hawkins planned his legacy project. A luxury residential community with shops and a golf course. Construction equipment stood idle in the late afternoon sun, the area secured by chain-link fencing bearing Oak Ridge Heights, future home of prosperity signs. Frank parked at a public viewpoint, studying the terrain with his engineer's eye. The site bordered protected wetlands, a detail that had caused controversy but was ultimately approved by the county commissioner. Something about the topography bothered him, though he couldn't immediately identify what. Beside him, Max grew increasingly agitated as they walked the public access path along the perimeter. At a particular section backing against densely wooded land, the dog stopped, hackles raised. "What is it, boy?" Frank murmured, noting the location. Nothing visually distinguished this area from the rest of the site, but Max's reaction was unmistakable. As Frank documented the coordinates on his phone, a security vehicle approached along the inside of the fence. The guard, a barrel-chested man with mirrored sunglasses, exited his truck. "This is private property, sir." "I'm on the public side," Frank responded calmly. The guard eyed Max suspiciously. "That dog looks familiar." "Does he?" Frank maintained a neutral expression. "Just a rescue. We're bird watching." "Without binoculars?" The guard's hand rested near his holster. "I suggest you find another hobby, old-timer. This area isn't safe for elderly folks. Uneven terrain, you know." "Be a shame if you had a fall out here all alone." The threat hung in the air between them. Frank nodded amicably. "Appreciate your concern for senior safety. Have a good day." As they returned to the car, Frank noticed a black SUV parked nearby, its driver watching intently. The vehicle followed at a distance as they left, turning off after several miles. "Made some friends today," Frank told Max, heart racing despite his outward calm. "Not the good kind." At home, Frank found his front door unlocked, though he distinctly remembered securing it. Max growled low in his throat as they entered. Nothing was obviously missing, but subtle signs of intrusion were everywhere. A chair slightly askew, Carol's photograph on the nightstand turned at a different angle, desk drawers not quite fully closed. The message was clear: "We can enter your space any time." While checking for missing items, the phone rang, an unlisted number. "Hello?" Frank answered cautiously. "Mr. Wilson?" The voice was male, deliberately nondescript. "I understand you've adopted a dog recently?" Frank's grip tightened on the receiver. "Who is this?" "A concerned citizen. Old men should know when to mind their business. Retirement should be peaceful. Don't you agree? So many accidents happen to the elderly. Falls, medication mix-ups, break-ins gone wrong." "Is that a threat?" Frank kept his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "A friendly suggestion. Enjoy your golden years, Mr. Wilson. Don't waste them digging in dirt." The line went dead. Frank sat heavily in his armchair, the implications clear. He'd barely scratched the surface, and already he'd attracted dangerous attention. The sensible choice was obvious. Return the dog, forget what he'd found, protect himself. But as he contemplated retreat, his gaze fell on a stack of old newspapers he'd been meaning to recycle. The headline on one caught his eye: Local journalist receives award for environmental reporting. The accompanying photograph showed a familiar face, Carol, 5 years younger, accepting a plaque. With trembling hands, Frank extracted the newspaper, reading the caption, "Carol Wilson recognized for her series on industrial pollution cover-ups in rural communities." Another piece clicked into place. A terrible, impossible piece that sent ice through his veins. Frank pulled out albums and files Carol had maintained, finding her professional portfolio. There, in a folder labeled Ongoing Research, he found preliminary notes about soil contamination concerns in Oak Ridge dated 3 years ago, before her sudden illness. The last entry, written in Carol's increasingly shaky handwriting, source confirms toxic dumping at North Section, meeting P for evidence tomorrow. P. Peterson. Frank sank to the floor, memories flooding back. Carol's mysterious symptoms appearing shortly after she'd mentioned working on a big local story. The rapid progression that baffled her doctors. How the mayor had attended her funeral, offering condolences and praising her community spirit while avoiding any mention of her investigative work. Max approached cautiously, pressing his warm body against Frank's side as the old man wept, the full implications of his discovery washing over him. This wasn't just about a missing detective or a development project anymore. This was about Carol. And suddenly, retreat was no longer an option. The morning light filtered through Frank's kitchen window as he spread Carol's research materials across the table. Sleep had eluded him, his mind churning with connections between his wife's illness and Peterson's disappearance. Max lay nearby, watchful eyes tracking Frank's movements as if understanding the gravity of their situation. Frank organized the documents chronologically, constructing a timeline. 3 years ago, Carol had begun investigating rumors of industrial waste being illegally disposed of in Oak Ridge. Her notes mentioned soil samples showing elevated levels of arsenic, lead, and other heavy metals, toxins associated with the manufacturing process of Value Tech Industries, the company funding Mayor Hawkins's development project. She was building a case, Frank murmured to Max. Environmental violations, cover-ups, possible bribes to county officials. He picked up a photograph of wetlands adjacent to the now cleared development site. And then she got sick. So damn sick so quickly. The symptoms had started subtly. Fatigue, headaches, occasional nausea Carol attributed to stress. Within weeks, she developed tremors, cognitive issues, and unexplained weight loss. Doctors initially suspected Parkinson's, then moved through increasingly dire diagnoses, autoimmune disorders, rare neurological conditions, and finally an aggressive form of cancer affecting multiple systems. But what if it wasn't cancer? Frank's voice trembled. What if she was poisoned to stop her investigation? He recalled how Mayor Hawkins had visited Carol in the hospital, bringing flowers and offering to connect them with specialists. How the medical bills had mysteriously been reduced, labeled as community care adjustment. At the time, Frank had been pathetically grateful for the assistance, never questioning its source. A cold rage settled in his chest, steadying his shaking hands. He turned to the USB drive recovered from Peterson's hiding spot, inserting it into his laptop. The drive contained dozens of files, soil reports, property records, and photographs of the development site at night, showing tanker trucks unloading into freshly dug pits. Most damning was a spreadsheet detailing payments from Value Tech to various officials, including substantial consulting fees to an LLC registered to Richard Hawkins' brother-in-law. The final file was an audio recording dated 1 week before Peterson's disappearance, a conversation between the detective and an unidentified informant discussing how waste from Value Tech's manufacturing process was being illegally buried at the future development site. They're planning to cap it with concrete, build right on top, the informant explained. Cheaper than proper disposal. By the time anyone gets sick, it'll be impossible to prove causation. Peterson's response was clear. I've got enough to take to the EPA and FBI. This stops now. Frank checked the recording date against Carol's journal entries. The timing aligned perfectly. She had planned to meet Peterson the day after this recording was made. Instead, Peterson vanished, and within weeks, Carol's health began deteriorating. The USB drive represented enough evidence to launch a federal investigation, yet Peterson had disappeared before using it. Why? The answer came as Frank reviewed the property records. The land originally belonged to Oak Ridge Cemetery Association until 1978, when it was sold to the city after being deemed geologically unsuitable for burials due to the high water table. Perfect for hiding evidence, though, Frank muttered. Anything leaching into the soil would reach groundwater quickly. He needed expert confirmation. Dialing the number for the town records office, Frank asked for Nancy Clark, an acquaintance who had worked there for decades. "Frank Wilson?" Nancy's warm voice brought a small comfort. "Haven't seen you since the church potluck last spring. How are you holding up?" "Managing," Frank replied. "Nancy, I need information about the old cemetery land that's now part of the development site. Anything you can tell me." A pause. "That's an odd request. Why the interest?" "Historical research," Frank lied, "thinking of writing something about town development." Nancy lowered her voice. "Between us, I've always thought that Sale was fishy. The paperwork came through my office, and some required environmental assessments were, let's say, incomplete. But Mayor Hawkins' father was mayor then, too, and questions weren't encouraged. Any chance I could see those records? They're public information. Come by this afternoon. I'll have them ready." At the county records office, Nancy, a silver-haired woman with librarian glasses and sensible shoes, ushered Frank into a research room. "Found everything we have on that property," she whispered, closing the door. "Including some things that weren't in the digital archives. The materials included original survey reports noting concerning levels of ground saturation and potential for contaminant mobility. Most interesting was a draft environmental impact statement that differed significantly from the final version, with entire sections on water quality concerns removed. This draft was never officially filed," Nancy explained. "I kept a copy because it seemed important, against the rules, but sometimes rules protect the wrong people." Frank squeezed her hand gratefully. "Nancy, did you know my Carol was investigating environmental issues before she got sick?" Nancy's eyes widened. "No, but that makes sense now. She came in several times requesting similar documents." She hesitated. "Frank, be careful. Another man came asking about these same records last year, a police detective. Peterson, I think. He never came back." "What about the current development?" "When does construction start? Groundbreaking ceremony is in 3 days. They're moving fast. Mayor wants foundations poured before the next council meeting. 3 days." A deadline that made Frank's chest tighten with anxiety. As they left the records office, Max, who had been waiting patiently in the car, became alert, ears forward. Frank followed his gaze to a black SUV identical to the one that had followed them yesterday, parked across the street. "We're being watched," Frank told Nancy quietly. "Don't look. Is there a back exit?" Nancy led him through the employee parking lot, where Frank called a taxi to take them to his car, parked several blocks away. The evasive maneuver left him winded, his heart racing dangerously in his chest. "You should see a doctor," Nancy urged, noticing his pallor. "No time," Frank replied, though the pain radiating down his left arm concerned him. "Nancy, can you keep copies of those documents somewhere safe?" "Somewhere not in your home or office?" She nodded, understanding the implication. "My sister's place in Athens. I'll send them tomorrow." That evening, Frank sat on his porch with Max, watching the sunset while contemplating their next move. The evidence he'd gathered suggested a conspiracy reaching back decades. illegal waste disposal, falsified reports, and now, potentially, 2 murders carefully disguised as a disappearance and illness. His phone rang. Sarah from the shelter. "Frank, how's it going with Max?" "We're adjusting," he replied cautiously. "Glad to hear it. Listen, something odd happened today. A man from animal control came asking about him, said he was checking microchip registrations. Wanted to know who adopted the German Shepherd brought in 3 weeks ago." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. "What did you tell him?" "That our records are confidential. He left his card, but something felt off." "The logo didn't match official county vehicles I've seen before. Trust that instinct," Frank advised. "If anyone else comes asking, you never heard of a German Shepherd." After hanging up, Frank examined Max more carefully. If the dog had been Peterson's K9 partner, he would have been microchipped with identifying information. Using a scanner borrowed from Sarah, Frank confirmed his suspicion. Max had a standard identification chip between his shoulder blades. "Let's see what secrets you're carrying, boy." The next morning, Frank visited Dr. Marcus Williams, a veterinarian and fellow Vietnam veteran who ran a small practice on the outskirts of town. After explaining the situation in carefully edited terms, Frank asked if the doctor could check Max's microchip. "Standard procedure is sending the number to the national database," Dr. Williams explained, running the scanner over Max's shoulders. The device beeped, displaying a code. "That's odd." "This isn't a standard format." "What do you mean?" "Regular pet microchips follow a specific numbering convention. This one's different, almost like a custom installation." The veterinarian frowned. "And there's something else. Feel here." He guided Frank's fingers to a small lump near the first chip. "That's a second microchip. I've never seen that before." "Can you read it?" "Not with this scanner. It's a different frequency." Dr. Williams studied Frank's face. "This isn't just about a lost dog, is it?" Frank hesitated, then made a decision. His owner was investigating environmental crimes before disappearing. "I believe he was killed to prevent exposure of toxic waste dumping at the development site." To Frank's surprise, the veterinarian nodded grimly. "I've treated 3 dogs in the past year with unexplained seizures and organ failure. All walked regularly near that property." He disappeared into a back room, returning with a different scanner. "Military-grade reader." "Don't ask why I have it." This device emitted a different tone when passed over Max's second chip. "Encrypted data," Dr. Williams explained. "Can't read it here, but I know someone who might help. Former intelligence officer who works in digital security now. Lives about an hour away." "Can you call him?" The veterinarian shook his head. "No phones. We'll drive there. Today." As they prepared to leave, Frank experienced another concerning episode, chest pain accompanied by shortness of breath. Dr. Williams noticed immediately. "You need medical attention, Frank. These are cardiac warning signs." "After," Frank insisted. "This can't wait." The drive to the security expert took them through winding back roads, the veterinarian deliberately avoiding main highways. "If they're tracking the dog's chip, they might be monitoring traffic cameras too," he explained. Frank stared out the window, processing how quickly his quiet retirement had transformed into what felt like a spy thriller. "How did you know about the development site being dangerous?" Dr. Williams kept his eyes on the road. "My daughter's an environmental engineer. She reviewed some of the public documents and said the soil testing data had been manipulated, obvious to anyone with training, but easy to slip past county inspectors. She filed complaints but was told the matter was under review." He glanced at Frank. "That was 14 months ago." They arrived at an unassuming farmhouse where Dr. Williams' contact, a lean, gray-haired man introduced only as Jackson, examined Max's unusual microchip with sophisticated equipment. "Military-grade crypto," Jackson confirmed, "designed to be read only with specific hardware." After an hour of work, he transferred the decrypted data to a secure thumb drive. Your detective friend was thorough. GPS coordinates, timestamps, and audio files, all authenticated with digital signatures admissible in federal court. The evidence was damning. Recordings of late-night waste disposal operations, coordinates marking precise dumping locations, soil sample results showing toxins at levels hundreds of times above legal limits, and photographs of Mayor Hawkins personally supervising the operations. Most recent entry was 10 months ago, the night before Peterson disappeared, Jackson noted. Location data shows the chip was at the development site, then moved rapidly away, eventually becoming stationary at what appears to be an abandoned hunting cabin 20 miles outside town. Frank studied the map coordinates. Could Peterson still be alive? Jackson's expression was grim. After 10 months, unlikely, but the cabin might contain additional evidence. As they prepared to leave, Jackson pulled Frank aside. They'll be tracking your movements. Your phone, your car, assume everything is compromised. Take this. He handed Frank an outdated flip phone. Prepaid, untraceable. I've programmed my number and the FBI field office in Atlanta. Why are you helping me? Frank asked. Jackson's eyes hardened. My brother died of aggressive cancer after investigating similar operations in Tennessee. Some patterns are too familiar to ignore. On the return journey, Frank's physical condition deteriorated further. The chest pain intensified, accompanied by cold sweats and dizziness. Despite his protests, Dr. Williams diverted to Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital. You're having a cardiac event, the veterinarian insisted. Evidence means nothing if you're dead. In the emergency room, Frank was diagnosed with atrial fibrillation exacerbated by stress and possible medication interactions. Your heart's rhythm is dangerously irregular, the doctor explained. We need to stabilize you before running more tests. As Frank lay connected to monitors, his phone rang, his daughter Emily. Dad, is everything okay? The hospital called me as your emergency contact. Minor hiccup, Frank downplayed. How's Seattle? I'm not in Seattle anymore, Emily replied. I'm at Atlanta Airport, catching a connecting flight to Oak Ridge. I'll be there in 3 hours. Emily, you don't need... Someone called me Dad. A man who wouldn't identify himself said you were in over your head and needed family intervention. What's going on? Frank's blood ran cold. They were using his daughter to control him. Emily, listen carefully. Don't come to the hospital. Go to a hotel. Don't tell anyone where you're staying. And call me from the hotel phone, not your cell. Dad, you're scaring me. I'll explain everything, but please trust me on this. After hanging up, Frank made a decision. Waiting until the nurse left, he disconnected his monitors and dressed quickly, setting off alarms at the nurse's station. By the time staff responded, Frank had slipped out through a service entrance where Dr. Williams waited with Max in the car. This is against medical advice, the veterinarian protested. My daughter's being dragged into this, Frank replied. I can't wait. As they pulled away from the hospital, Frank's phone rang again. Detective Mitchell. Wilson, where are you? Why? Because there's a warrant out for your arrest, criminal trespass and theft of evidence in Peterson's case. They're saying you broke into county records and stole files. Mitchell's voice lowered. It's a setup. They're moving the timeline up. Groundbreaking ceremony has been rescheduled for tomorrow morning. Whatever they're hiding, they're about to bury it under concrete foundations. Frank shared what they'd discovered about the second microchip and the cabin coordinates. I'll check it out, Mitchell promised. Meanwhile, stay out of sight. They've got roadblocks on major routes into town, officially for a fugitive manhunt. As darkness fell, Frank faced his most desperate hours since Vietnam. His health was failing, his daughter was being used as leverage, and time was running out. Tomorrow morning, bulldozers would begin moving earth at the development site, potentially destroying evidence of both environmental crimes and Peterson's fate. In Dr. Williams' spare bedroom, Frank studied the maps and evidence they'd gathered, searching for a strategy. Max sat beside him, their partnership now cemented by shared danger and purpose. "What would Carol do?" Frank asked the empty air, his hand absently stroking Max's fur. The answer came immediately. She would find a way to get the evidence to someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Taking Jackson's prepaid phone, Frank made a call to a number he'd memorized from Peterson's files, the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. As he outlined the situation to an increasingly interested federal agent, a plan began taking shape. Sometimes the best defense wasn't retreat, but advance. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for 9 a.m., a carefully orchestrated media event with local television coverage, distinguished guests, and Mayor Hawkins ceremonially turning the first shovel of earth at the future site of Oak Ridge Heights. By 7 a.m., workers had already erected a white event tent, arranged folding chairs in neat rows, and positioned a podium emblazoned with the development's logo, a stylized oak tree rising above rolling hills. Frank observed from the tree line half a mile away, using binoculars borrowed from Dr. Williams. His body ached from the exertion of the previous day, his heart occasionally fluttering with alarming irregularity. Beside him, Max remained perfectly still, as if understanding the need for absolute silence. "EPA agent said they need at least 4 hours to get a team here," Frank whispered to the dog. "We need to stall them somehow." His conversation with the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division had been promising but frustrating. While the evidence warranted immediate action, bureaucratic protocols required formal approvals before deploying agents. The official had promised to expedite the process, but warned that proper authorization might take until afternoon. By then, the critical areas of the site could be disturbed, evidence destroyed. Frank's phone vibrated. Detective Mitchell calling from the secure line Jackson had provided. "I found the cabin." Mitchell's voice was tight with controlled emotion. You need to see this." "How quickly can you get here?" "I can't leave now," Frank explained. "The ceremony starts in 2 hours. Whatever they're hiding, they'll make sure it's gone by nightfall." "Peterson's alive, Frank." The words hung in the air between them, impossible yet undeniable. "What?" "Barely," Mitchell clarified. "Dehydrated, malnourished, heavily sedated. I've called an ambulance, but he's in bad shape. Looks like they've been keeping him drugged for months. They wanted information from him about the evidence he collected." Frank's mind raced. "Is he conscious? Can he talk?" "In and out. He recognized me. Asked about Commander, your dog. Listen, the paramedics are 20 minutes out. I can't leave him, but you need to know, he kept repeating something about the north corner and 3 meters down. Does that mean anything to you?" It aligned with the coordinates from Max's microchip, the exact location where the dog had become agitated during their visit to the development site. "It means I know where to look," Frank replied. "Mitchell, we need time. The EPA is coming, but not soon enough. I'll see what I can do after Peterson's secure. Be careful. These people tried to kill a cop. They won't hesitate with a civilian." After ending the call, Frank surveyed the increasingly busy construction site. Workers were positioning ceremonial shovels with blue ribbons, while security personnel established a perimeter. Among them, Frank recognized the guard who had threatened him days earlier. His gaze shifted to the earth-moving equipment parked nearby, bulldozers and backhoes ready to begin work immediately following the ceremony. According to the schedule he'd seen in Carol's files, excavation for foundation footings would begin in the north section, precisely where the evidence was likely buried. Frank needed a distraction, something to delay construction without revealing his presence. As he pondered options, a caravan of black SUVs approached the site, Mayor Hawkins and his entourage arriving early to inspect preparations. Through his binoculars, Frank observed Hawkins, a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with carefully maintained silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference. The mayor surveyed the arrangement with visible satisfaction, occasionally consulting with a nervous-looking site manager. "That's our target," Frank told Max softly. "The man responsible for everything. Peterson's condition, the toxic dumping, and very possibly your wife's death." For a moment, anger threatened to overwhelm Frank's tactical thinking. The urge to confront Hawkins directly was powerful, to demand answers about Carol, to make him face the consequences of his actions. But such an approach would only result in Frank's immediate arrest, achieving nothing. A commotion at the site entrance drew his attention. Police vehicles were arriving, lights flashing, but sirens silent. Officers established positions around the perimeter, their presence far exceeding normal security for such an event. "They're expecting trouble," Frank murmured. His phone vibrated again, an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Dad? Emily?" Frank's heart leaped. "Where are you?" "At some motel outside town." "Dad, what's going on? There are police at your house and the local news is saying you're wanted for questioning about stolen documents." Frank closed his eyes, gathering strength. "Emily, listen carefully. Mom's death wasn't what we thought. She was investigating environmental crimes connected to Mayor Hawkins' development project. I believe she was deliberately poisoned to stop her investigation." Silence followed, then a shaky breath. Dad, that sounds paranoid. You need help." "I have evidence," Frank insisted. "Mom's research notes, soil samples showing toxic contamination, financial records proving bribes to officials. The detective who was investigating the same thing disappeared 10 months ago. He was being held prisoner until this morning." "You're not making sense," Emily's voice trembled. "The hospital said you left against medical advice. You're having heart problems. These kinds of delusions can be—" "They're not delusions," Frank interrupted, frustration mounting. "Your mother was murdered, Emily, and they're about to destroy the evidence unless we stop them." Another silence. "We? I have Peterson's police dog. He led me to hidden evidence." Even to his own ears, the story sounded fantastical. "Emily, I know how this sounds, but I'm not confused or delusional. This is happening. I'm coming to get you," she decided. "Tell me where you are." "No, it's too dangerous. Stay at the motel. If I don't call you by noon, contact this number." Frank recited the EPA agent's direct line. "Tell them everything I've told you." As Frank ended the call, movement at the development site caught his attention. Workers were uncovering a section of ground near the north corner, exactly where Peterson had indicated evidence might be buried. They were starting early, before the ceremony, before witnesses arrived. "They're destroying evidence right now," Frank whispered to Max. The time for careful planning had ended. Making a swift decision, Frank dialed Detective Mitchell. "They're digging at the north corner already. We're out of time." "I can't get there for at least an hour," Mitchell replied, voice strained. "The ambulance just arrived. Peterson's condition is critical. Possible organ failure from long-term sedation. I can't leave him." "Understood. I'm going in." "Frank, don't—" He ended the call, mind made up. Turning to Max, he secured the special whistle around his neck and checked that the recording device Jackson had provided was functioning. "One way or another, we're getting this evidence today," he told the dog. "For Carol, for Peterson, for you." They circled through the woods until reaching the portion of fence nearest the excavation activity. Only 2 workers were present, following directions from a supervisor who consulted frequently with someone via radio. Their body language suggested urgency rather than routine preparation. Frank waited until the supervisor stepped away to take another call, then used bolt cutters from Dr. Williams' toolbox to create an opening in the fence. Signaling Max to follow, he slipped onto the property, using construction materials for cover as they approached the excavation area. The workers had uncovered what appeared to be industrial barrels buried approximately 3 feet down. Even from a distance, Frank could see warning labels partially visible beneath caked mud. "Evidence," he breathed, activating the recording device and carefully documenting the scene from behind a stack of drainage pipes. One worker climbed down into the shallow pit, examining the barrels. "These aren't on the manifest," he called to his colleague. "They look old, maybe from the original contamination." "Don't matter," the other replied. "Boss says dig 'em up and get 'em on the truck before the ceremony. No pictures, no questions." Frank continued recording as the men attached chains to hoist the first barrel out of the ground. The container was clearly marked with hazard symbols and a faded Value Tech Industries logo, direct evidence connecting the company to illegal dumping. As they worked, Frank heard vehicles approaching, a truck and several cars entering through the main gate. Ducking lower, he watched Mayor Hawkins exit one vehicle accompanied by a man in an expensive suit whom Frank recognized from Value Tech promotional materials. CEO Robert Chambers. The two men approached the excavation site with evident concern, their conversation becoming audible as they drew nearer. "I thought this section was cleared last month," Chambers hissed. "The geological survey showed nothing here," Hawkins replied tersely. "Someone made a mistake." "Fix it," Chambers ordered. "If those barrels are photographed during your publicity stunt, we're both finished." Hawkins nodded to the security team. "Establish a wider perimeter. No one approaches this section during the ceremony. And accelerate the timeline. I want foundation concrete poured here by end of day." As they discussed containment strategies, Frank inched closer, still recording. Max, however, had different ideas. Upon seeing and apparently recognizing Mayor Hawkins, the German Shepherd's training activated. Before Frank could grab his collar, Max bolted from their hiding place, racing toward the mayor with purposeful intent. "What the?" Hawkins spun around as security shouted warnings. Max didn't attack but circled the mayor, barking with unmistakable recognition. The security team drew weapons, creating a chaotic scene as workers scrambled away from the excavation. "Commander?" Hawkins' face drained of color. "That's impossible." Frank had no choice but to reveal himself. "Call off your security," he demanded, emerging from behind the construction materials. "That dog is evidence in a criminal investigation." Recognition dawned in Hawkins' eyes. Frank Wilson, the grieving widower. His composure returned quickly, replaced by practiced political charm. "Mr. Wilson, you're trespassing on private property, and I believe local law enforcement has some questions for you about stolen documents." "Like they had questions for Detective Peterson before he disappeared?" Frank countered, approaching steadily despite the weapons trained on him. "He's been found, Richard, alive. Talking to federal authorities as we speak." The flash of panic across Hawkins' face confirmed everything. The mayor recovered quickly, addressing his security team. "Mr. Wilson is clearly unwell. His wife's passing has affected his mental state. Please escort him from the property, gently, and contain that animal." "The animal," Frank replied, "is a trained police K-9 who just identified you by scent." Interesting reaction from someone who claims never to have encountered him before. Two security officers approached Frank while others attempted to corner Max, who evaded them with practiced agility. "You're making a serious mistake," Frank warned them. "This site is under federal investigation for illegal toxic waste disposal. Those barrels contain evidence of environmental crimes spanning decades." "Mr. Wilson," Hawkins interjected smoothly, "you're experiencing a cardiac event. Your daughter called us, concerned about your health and recent delusions. We have an ambulance standing by." The mention of Emily sent a chill through Frank. Had they somehow gotten to her? Or was Hawkins bluffing? "Charles Peterson was investigating you," Frank continued, playing for time while scanning for escape routes. He discovered your arrangement with Valuetech, allowing them to dump manufacturing waste on this property in exchange for development funding and political contributions. CEO Chambers stepped forward. That's defamation, Mr. Wilson. Legally actionable defamation. It's not defamation if it's true, Frank retorted, and I have proof, soil samples, financial records, and Peterson's testimony. He turned back to Hawkins. Did you kill my wife too? Or just have her poisoned slowly to make it look like cancer? Hawkins' composed facade cracked momentarily. Security, remove this man immediately. He's clearly delusional and potentially dangerous. As guards closed in, Frank locked eyes with the mayor. Peterson is your brother, isn't he? I saw the family resemblance in photographs. Your own brother, and you had him imprisoned and drugged for 10 months. The mayor's expression hardened into something truly dangerous. With a subtle gesture, he dismissed the other workers, leaving only security personnel. My brother was always the golden boy, Hawkins said quietly, dropping the political persona. The hero, the decorated Marine, the honest cop. I was just the politician nobody respected. His voice dripped with long festering resentment. Then he threatened everything I'd built because of some barrels buried decades ago. Toxic waste that would never have been discovered if he hadn't gone looking. People are getting sick, Frank pressed. Carroll was investigating cancer clusters in neighborhoods bordering this property. Unfortunate coincidences, Hawkins dismissed, or lifestyle choices. People smoke, drink, eat processed foods, then blame industry when they get sick. He stepped closer to Frank. Your wife was poking around in matters beyond her expertise, drawing irresponsible conclusions. When I tried to reason with her, she threatened to publish anyway. So you poisoned her? Hawkins shrugged slightly. I arranged for her to receive certain compounds known to mimic cancer symptoms. Untraceable, gradual, completely deniable. A tragedy, certainly, but necessary for the greater good. His eyes were cold, calculating. This development will bring thousands of jobs to Oak Ridge. The tax revenue will rebuild schools, fund police departments, revitalize downtown. What's one nosy journalist against all that? Frank lunged toward Hawkins, blind rage overcoming caution, but security intercepted him, restraining his arms as pain shot through his chest. You'll never prove any of this, Hawkins continued calmly. Those barrels will disappear within the hour. Peterson is barely coherent after months of sedation, his testimony worthless. And you, Frank, he smiled thinly, will suffer a stress-induced heart attack while being escorted from private property. Tragic, but not unexpected given your medical history and recent erratic behavior. As security tightened their grip, Frank felt his heart racing dangerously, each beat an irregular stutter in his chest. The recording device concealed in his jacket was capturing everything, but would be useless if he couldn't escape to deliver it. In that moment of desperation, a sharp whistle cut through the air, not from Frank, but from beyond the fence line. Max immediately responded, breaking away from the guards attempting to corner him and racing toward the sound. Detective Mitchell emerged from the tree line, police badge raised. Oak Ridge Police. Release that man immediately. Momentary confusion rippled through the security team, their hold on Frank loosening slightly. Taking advantage, Frank drove an elbow into the nearest guard's ribs and broke free, stumbling toward Mitchell as his heart protested the exertion. Federal agents are 5 minutes out, Mitchell called. Stand down now. It was a bluff. Frank knew the EPA team was still hours away, but the security team hesitated, looking to Hawkins for direction. The mayor's face darkened. He's one detective with a suspended badge. Contain this situation now. As guards advanced, Mitchell drew his service weapon. Don't test me on this, Richard. I've got nothing left to lose. The standoff hung in perfect tension for 3 heartbeats before chaos erupted. Max, responding to another whistle command, charged back into the construction site, directly toward the excavated barrels. The distraction allowed Frank to close the distance to Mitchell, who covered their retreat toward the fence opening. "Federal cavalry isn't coming, is it?" Frank gasped as they ducked behind equipment. "Not yet," Mitchell admitted. "Peterson's been transported to Atlanta, federal protective custody. I came straight here after securing him." He glanced at Frank's ashen face. "You look like hell, old-timer." "Feel worse," Frank admitted, clutching his chest. "But we got what we needed." He patted the recording device. Hawkins confessed to everything: poisoning Carroll, imprisoning Peterson, the waste dumping. All recorded. A shout from the site interrupted them. The security team had spotted Max investigating the exposed barrels. 2 guards approached with catch poles. "Max, come!" Mitchell whistled the recall command, but the dog remained focused on the barrels, pawing at the earth beside them. "He's found something," Frank realized. Something important. Despite Mitchell's protests, Frank staggered back toward the construction site, keeping low behind materials. Max was digging frantically beside the first barrel, uncovering what appeared to be fabric. A security guard reached the dog first, attempting to loop the catch pole around his neck. Max dodged, continuing his desperate excavation until a terrible discovery emerged. Human remains, partially decomposed but recognizable as an adult male in tattered clothing. "Jesus Christ," Mitchell breathed, having followed Frank. "That's not Peterson." "No," Frank agreed grimly. "Someone else who discovered their secret." The gruesome finding created momentary paralysis among security personnel. Frank seized the opportunity to take clear photographs with the recording device while Mitchell covered him, weapon drawn. Hawkins appeared behind the guards, face contorted with rage upon seeing the exposed remains. "Contain this now," he ordered. "All of it." 2 guards rushed Frank and Mitchell, while others moved to conceal the body. In the ensuing struggle, Frank felt a searing pain tear through his chest, not from external injury but from within, his heart finally rebelling against the sustained stress. He collapsed to his knees as Mitchell fought off attackers. Through tunneling vision, Frank watched Max break free from a guard's grasp and race to his side, standing protectively over him as consciousness began to fade. The last thing Frank registered was the distant wail of sirens approaching the development site. Not the promised EPA agents, but local police responding to reports of trespassing and disturbance. As darkness closed in, Frank's final thought was of Carroll, her smile, her determination, her unwavering pursuit of truth. He had failed to save her, but perhaps, through his actions today, her death might yet serve justice. His hand found Max's fur as the world went black. Rhythmic beeping penetrated the darkness, pulling Frank back to consciousness. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the distinctive softness of hospital sheets oriented him before he even opened his eyes. When he finally did, harsh fluorescent lighting assaulted his vision, causing him to wince and turn away. "Dad?" Emily's voice, tentative and strained. "Can you hear me?" Frank attempted to respond, but his throat felt raw, his voice emerging as little more than a rasp. "Water?" Cool plastic touched his lips. A straw. He sipped gratefully, each swallow painful but necessary. When he tried again to speak, his voice emerged stronger. "How long?" 3 days, Emily replied, moving into his field of vision. His daughter looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, her normally neat appearance disheveled. "You had a major cardiac event?" "They had to resuscitate you at the construction site." Memories flooded back. The confrontation with Hawkins, the exposed barrels, the human remains Max had uncovered. Max. "The dog?" Frank asked urgently. Emily's expression softened. "He's okay. Animal control took him initially, but Detective Mitchell intervened. He's staying at Mitchell's place for now." Relief washed over Frank, followed immediately by concern. "The evidence is secure," a new voice interjected. Frank turned to see a middle-aged woman in a suit standing in the doorway. Agent Diana Reeves, EPA Criminal Investigation Division. Your recording device was recovered at the scene, Mr. Wilson. The contents are illuminating. She entered the room fully, pulling a chair beside his bed. Mayor Hawkins has been arrested along with 3 executives from Valuetech Industries. The excavation site has been secured as a crime scene, with our forensic team processing the area. The body, Frank began, being examined by federal forensic specialists, Reeves confirmed. Preliminary identification suggests it may be a journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who went missing 3 years ago while investigating industrial pollution stories. Another victim, like Carol. Frank closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of this information. What about Peterson? He asked. Recovering under federal protection, Reeves replied. His testimony, combined with your recording of Hawkins' confession and the physical evidence at the site, provides a compelling case. The U.S. Attorney's Office is preparing multiple indictments: environmental crimes, attempted murder, false imprisonment, and potentially 2 counts of homicide. Frank attempted to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his chest. Emily immediately adjusted his bed, raising the head portion to a more comfortable angle. Carol, Frank said, his voice breaking. My wife. He admitted poisoning her. Agent Reeves nodded solemnly. We're reopening the investigation into her death. The recording captured Hawkins' admission regarding compounds known to mimic cancer symptoms. Our toxicologists are reviewing her medical records and will likely request exhumation to test for specific toxins. The clinical discussion of Carol's remains sent a wave of nausea through Frank. Emily noticed his distress, placing a hand gently on his arm. Maybe we should continue this later, she suggested to Reeves. He just woke up. The agent stood, nodding. Of course, Mr. Wilson, we'll need a formal statement when you're stronger. For now, focus on recovery. She placed a business card on the bedside table. Call when you're ready. And thank you. Your actions exposed crimes that have been destroying lives for decades. After Reeves departed, silence hung between father and daughter. Frank studied Emily's face, the familiar features that combined his determination with Carol's compassion. They hadn't spoken properly in years, their relationship fractured by misunderstandings and the distance that had grown following Carol's death. You didn't believe me, Frank finally said, not accusingly but factually. Emily sighed, adjusting the thin hospital blanket across his legs. When you called saying Mom was murdered and you were investigating with a police dog, it sounded delusional, Frank finished, the ramblings of a grieving, confused old man. Yes, she admitted, but I was wrong. So wrong. Tears welled in her eyes. The hospital called saying you'd left against medical advice. Then Detective Mitchell contacted me, explaining everything. By the time I reached the development site, they were loading you into an ambulance. Your heart had stopped, Dad, for almost 2 minutes. The revelation settled heavily on Frank. He'd come within seconds of joining Carol, of leaving this unfinished. The doctors say you need surgery, Emily continued. A pacemaker, possibly more depending on further tests. Your heart sustained significant damage. Frank nodded, unsurprised. He'd felt the deterioration, pushed his aging body beyond reasonable limits. And Mitchell? Is he okay? Administrative leave pending investigation, Emily explained. Standard procedure when an officer discharges their weapon, though he didn't hit anyone. The police chief is treading carefully. Half the department was loyal to Hawkins, the other half suspected corruption but feared speaking out. Frank's gaze drifted to the window, where afternoon sunlight filtered through half-drawn blinds. 3 days lost to unconsciousness. How much evidence might have been destroyed in that time? How many co-conspirators might have fled? The EPA has the site locked down tight, Emily said, reading his thoughts. Ground-penetrating radar has identified at least 37 additional barrels buried across the property, They're saying it's one of the worst cases of illegal toxic dumping they've seen in decades. Hawkins' lawyers will fight everything, Frank predicted. They'll claim I manipulated the recording, that Peterson is confused from medication, that— Stop, Emily interrupted gently. Let the federal prosecutors worry about that. You've done your part, Dad, more than your part. But Frank couldn't stop. His mind raced with loose ends, with threats to the case, with ways Hawkins might escape justice. The development records are being reviewed by forensic accountants, Emily assured him. Dad, please, you need to rest. Frustrated by his weakness, Frank struggled against the fatigue pulling at him. I can't rest until— Until what? Emily challenged, a flash of her mother's fire showing through. Until you've personally examined every document. Until you've interrogated every suspect. Until you've dug up every barrel with your bare hands. Her voice broke. I already lost Mom. I can't lose you too. The raw emotion in her words penetrated Frank's obsessive focus. For the first time, he truly saw the toll recent events had taken on his daughter. The fear, the exhaustion, the lingering shock of discovering her mother's death might have been murder. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Emily wiped away tears. When Mitchell called, he said you'd collapsed at the construction site. All I could think was that I'd wasted years being angry about trivial things, and now I might never get to tell you. She trailed off, composing herself. The doctor said stress could trigger another episode. Fatal next time. So please, just focus on getting better. Frank reached for her hand, struck by how their roles had suddenly reversed. His daughter, now the caretaker, the voice of reason. I'll try, he promised, though part of him still strained toward unfinished business. A nurse entered, checking monitors and administering medication through Frank's IV. This will help with pain and inflammation, she explained, but it might make you drowsy. As the medication entered his system, Frank felt the edges of his consciousness softening. Before surrendering to sleep, he had one more question. Emily, how did they find me at the construction site? Who called the police? His daughter's expression turned grim. That's complicated. When I couldn't reach you after our call, I contacted the local police, worried about your health. They were already preparing to arrest you for document theft from the county records office. She hesitated. Dad, Nancy Clark was found in her home that morning. They're calling it a suicide, but Mitchell says— No! Frank interrupted, ice forming in his veins despite the warming medication. Nancy wouldn't. Mitchell thinks she was silenced, Emily confirmed softly. She'd made copies of the altered environmental reports. They were missing from her sister's house in Athens. Another life destroyed in Hawkins' desperate attempt to protect his secrets. Frank closed his eyes, grief and guilt washing over him. If he hadn't involved Nancy— It's not your fault, Emily insisted, reading his expression. From what Mitchell said, she'd been keeping those documents for years, waiting for someone to expose the truth. The medication pulled Frank deeper toward unconsciousness, but his mind clung to a final concern. Max, he murmured. Need to see him. Hospital rules don't allow. Please, Frank insisted, fighting the encroaching darkness. He's the last connection to Peterson, to Carol's work. I'll see what I can arrange. Emily's voice came from increasingly far away. Rest now, Dad. Frank surrendered to medicinal oblivion, dreams filled with barrels leaking poison into groundwater, with Carol's final painful days, with Max digging desperately at contaminated earth. In his dreams, the dead rose from their shallow graves, faces twisted in accusation, not just the unidentified journalist, but others. Nancy Clark, smelling of the lavender perfume she always wore, victims of cancer clusters near the development site. And Carol, always Carol, asking why he hadn't seen the truth sooner. why he hadn't saved her. He woke gasping in the middle of the night, heart monitor beeping erratically until a nurse rushed in to stabilize him. After checking his vitals and administering a mild sedative, she left him alone with the persistent question that haunted his semi-conscious thoughts. How many others had suffered while he remained blind to the corruption poisoning his town? The following days brought a parade of medical specialists, law enforcement officials, and lawyers. Frank's cardiac surgeon explained the extent of damage to his heart. Stress-induced cardiomyopathy compounded by existing coronary artery disease. "You need a pacemaker," the doctor insisted, "and possibly a defibrillator. Without intervention, your prognosis is limited." FBI agents joined EPA investigators in taking Frank's official statement, recording hours of testimony about Carroll's research, Peterson's investigation, and the confrontation at the development site. They confirmed what Mitchell had already told him. Peterson was recovering slowly, his testimony corroborating Frank's account of toxic dumping and Hawkins's involvement. "The human remains you discovered have been identified as Jonathan Mercer, environmental correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution," the FBI agent informed him. "Reported missing 3 years ago while investigating anonymous tips about industrial pollution. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the skull." Another piece falling into place. Frank recalled seeing Mercer's byline on articles Carroll had collected, a professional connection that had perhaps led both journalists to the same dangerous truth. A prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office outlined the developing case. "Mayor Hawkins is claiming the recording was edited or coerced, but our audio experts have verified its authenticity. Combined with physical evidence from the site and Detective Peterson's testimony, we're building a strong case." "And Carroll?" Frank asked, the question that mattered most to him. The prosecutor's expression softened slightly. "The medical examiner is reviewing tissue samples preserved during her treatment. Identifying specific toxins after this time is challenging, but possible if they used certain heavy metals or compounds that accumulate in bone tissue. In other words, they might never know with certainty." The realization settled like lead in Frank's stomach. Justice for Carroll might remain incomplete, her murder unprovable beyond reasonable doubt. On the 5th day of hospitalization, Emily finally succeeded in arranging a special visit. Detective Mitchell arrived with Max, who had been cleared by a police veterinarian as a therapy animal for this specific occasion. The German Shepherd entered Frank's hospital room cautiously, sniffing the unfamiliar equipment before recognizing Frank and approaching the bed with visible excitement. "Hey, boy," Frank greeted him, voice thick with emotion, as Max gently rested his head on the edge of the mattress. "You did good. Real good." Mitchell hung back, observing the reunion with evident satisfaction. "He's been restless at my place. Keeps checking the door like he's waiting for someone." "Peterson?" Frank asked, scratching behind Max's ears. "Or you," Mitchell suggested. "Dogs form attachments quickly in high-stress situations." "You two went through hell together." Frank nodded, understanding the bond that had formed between them. "How's Peterson doing?" "Better physically. Mentally?" Mitchell shrugged. 10 months of enforced sedation leaves marks. He has gaps in his memory, confusion about timeline. But his core recollections about the investigation and Hawkins's involvement remain intact. "And the case?" Mitchell's expression turned grim. "Hawkins made bail yesterday. His legal team is formidable. Former federal prosecutors, political connections. They're already spinning a narrative about a confused old man with a vendetta against progress conspiring with a mentally unstable detective." Frank's jaw tightened. "The evidence is substantial," Mitchell assured him. "But wealth and political power create their own reality sometimes." Hawkins held a press conference this morning presenting himself as the victim of a conspiracy. Half the town still supports him. The news settled heavily on Frank. He'd known this wouldn't be easy, that powerful men rarely faced true consequences, but hearing how quickly Hawkins had regained footing sparked fresh anger. "What about Value Tech?" he asked. "Their stock is tanking. They've distanced themselves from Hawkins, claiming they were misled about proper disposal of manufacturing byproducts." Mitchell's tone conveyed his skepticism. "Classic corporate strategy. Sacrifice the political middleman to protect the company." Max sensed Frank's distress, pressing closer. The dog's presence offered comfort beyond words, a silent affirmation that truth existed independent of legal outcomes or public relations strategies. "The EPA is continuing excavation," Mitchell added, offering more encouraging news. "They've confirmed contamination levels hundreds of times above legal limits. Whatever happens with the criminal cases, the civil liability will be enormous. Class action lawsuits are already being prepared on behalf of affected residents." Some justice then, but possibly not enough. Not for Carol, whose brilliant mind had been systematically poisoned. Not for Peterson, whose loyalty to duty had cost him 10 months of freedom. Not for Nancy Clark, whose courage had led to her death, disguised as suicide. As if reading his thoughts, Mitchell leaned closer. "This isn't over, Frank. We've landed the first blow, but the fight's just starting. Hawkins and Valuetech are powerful, but they're not invincible." Frank stroked Max's fur, drawing strength from the dog's steadfast presence. "What happens to him?" he asked, nodding toward Max. "Officially, he's evidence in an ongoing investigation," Mitchell explained. "Once Peterson is further recovered, he'll need to make decisions about Commander's future. Given his own medical challenges, he might not be able to resume K9 handling." The implication hung unspoken between them. Max might need a permanent home, and Frank had already proven his commitment to the dog. "I should warn you," Mitchell added, "your involvement in this case has made you a target. Hawkins has resources and connections. If you're planning to stay in Oak Ridge—" The unfinished sentence contained clear warning. Frank glanced at Emily, who had remained silent during this exchange, her expression troubled. "I've been thinking about that," she said, meeting her father's eyes. "Dad, what if you came to Seattle for a while? Just until things settle here. I have plenty of room, and the cardiac specialists at University of Washington Medical Center are excellent." The suggestion caught Frank off guard. Leave Oak Ridge, abandon the fight when it was just beginning. His instinct was immediate rejection, but Emily's concerned expression gave him pause. "I can't run away," he said finally. "This is home. Carol is here." "Mom is gone," Emily replied gently, "and she wouldn't want you risking your life in some crusade for justice." "Wouldn't she?" Frank challenged. "Your mother dedicated her career to exposing truth, regardless of personal cost. She believed justice mattered, that standing against corruption was worth the risk." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "And it got her killed, Dad. It got her killed." The raw pain in his daughter's voice struck Frank like a physical blow. For the first time, he fully comprehended Emily's perspective. Watching her father follow the same dangerous path that had led to her mother's death, her fear wasn't irrational. It was founded in terrible precedent. Mitchell cleared his throat awkwardly. "I should get Max back." The hospital only approved a short visit. He gestured for the dog to follow, but Max remained firmly beside Frank's bed, reluctant to leave. "It's okay, boy," Frank assured him, though his voice betrayed his emotion. "We'll see each other again soon." With obvious reluctance, Max finally followed Mitchell from the room, looking back repeatedly until they disappeared through the doorway. Alone with Emily, Frank faced the choice she had presented: safety in Seattle or continued danger in Oak Ridge. The cardiac monitors betrayed his agitation, beeping with increasing frequency until he consciously slowed his breathing. "I need time to think," he told his daughter. "This isn't just about me anymore." Emily nodded, relief evident in her expression. "That's all I'm asking. Just consider the options before charging back into battle." That night, lying awake in his hospital room, Frank contemplated the path forward. The surgeon had scheduled his pacemaker procedure for the following week. Recovery would require weeks of limited activity, medication adjustments, cardiac rehabilitation. His body, the failing instrument that had nearly betrayed him at the crucial moment, required attention he could no longer postpone. Yet his mind remained fixed on unfinished business, Hawkins walking free, spinning narratives to salvage his reputation, value tech executives distancing themselves from consequences, the uncertainty surrounding Carol's justice. Frank's gaze drifted to her photograph on the bedside table. Emily had brought it from his house. Carol's smile, captured in happier days, seemed to hold the answer he sought. What would she advise? Fight on, regardless of personal cost, or step back to preserve what remained of his health and relationship with their daughter? The answer came not in words but in memory. Carol at her desk late one night, exhausted after weeks investigating a particularly difficult story. "Sometimes," she had told him, "justice isn't a sprint but a marathon. The truth doesn't need heroes. It needs persistent witnesses." Persistent witnesses. The phrase resonated through Frank's consciousness as sleep finally claimed him. Perhaps there were multiple ways to fight this battle, not all requiring him to place his life on the line. 1 month after his confrontation with Mayor Hawkins, Frank sat on his front porch watching the summer sunset paint Oak Ridge's distant water tower in shades of amber and gold. The scar from his pacemaker implantation still ached beneath his shirt, a constant reminder of how close he'd come to joining Carol. Beside him, Max lay vigilant, ears occasionally twitching at neighborhood sounds. "Beautiful evening," Frank commented to the dog. "Carol always loved this time of day." The German shepherd's eyes tracked a squirrel darting across the yard, but his disciplined training kept him from giving chase. In the weeks since Frank's release from the hospital, Max had become a permanent fixture in his life, a special arrangement negotiated by Detective Mitchell with the department pending Peterson's formal decision about the dog's future. Frank's physical recovery progressed slowly. The pacemaker regulated his damaged heart, but his energy remained limited, his body demanding rest after even modest exertion. Emily had extended her leave of absence from her Seattle architecture firm, temporarily moving into Carol's old sewing room to help with his recovery. Their relationship had entered a period of healing as well. Painful conversations about Carol's death, about the years of strained communication, about regrets and misunderstandings slowly giving way to tentative rebuilding. Having Emily in the house brought both comfort and occasional tension, the parent-child dynamic complicated by his new dependence. The screen door creaked as Emily emerged with 2 glasses of iced tea, handing one to Frank before settling into the adjacent rocker. "Mitchell called while you were napping," she reported. "Grand jury returns indictments tomorrow." "He thinks they have enough to charge Hawkins with first-degree murder for the journalist, Mercer, and second-degree for Nancy Clark." Frank nodded, processing the information. "And Carol?" Emily's expression softened with familiar regret. Still inconclusive, the toxicology results showed elevated levels of certain compounds, but not definitively enough to prove deliberate poisoning beyond reasonable doubt. She reached for his hand. "I'm sorry, Dad." The news was disappointing, but not surprising. Frank had prepared himself for this possibility, that Carol's murder might never be legally proven, that Hawkins might escape accountability for at least one of his crimes. "What matters is we know," Frank said finally. and he knows we know." They sat in companionable silence, watching neighborhood children play a last game of catch before sunset. The rhythms of ordinary life continued in Oak Ridge despite the scandal that had rocked the community. Families grilling dinners, retirees tending gardens, teenagers skateboarding down quiet streets. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, the town remained deeply divided. Hawkins's supporters and detractors engaged in heated debates at council meetings, in church fellowship halls, and across backyard fences. Yard signs proclaimed either "Stand with Mayor Hawkins" or "Justice for Oak Ridge," visual markers of the schism running through the community. Frank had become an unwilling public figure, vilified by some as a confused old man whose allegations had damaged the town's economic prospects, celebrated by others as a hero who had exposed decades of corruption. Neither characterization felt accurate to Frank, who saw himself as simply a man who couldn't look away from injustice. "The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter called again," Emily mentioned, sipping her tea. "She's working on a feature about Mom's environmental journalism and connection to the Oak Ridge case." Frank nodded. Media interest had been intense since the story broke nationally. Carol's professional reputation had experienced posthumous revival, her earlier investigative work re-examined for previously unrecognized connections to corporate pollution cases. "I told her you'd think about an interview," Emily continued, "but only after your next cardiac checkup. Dr. Stevens was clear about minimizing stress." "I'm not made of glass," Frank protested mildly, though he knew his daughter's concern was justified. His recovery remained precarious, each follow-up appointment revealing the extensive damage his heart had sustained. Emily's phone chimed with a text message. After reading it, she turned to Frank with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. That was Mitchell. "Peterson's being discharged from the rehabilitation facility tomorrow. He's asked to see you." The news stirred complex emotions. Despite their shared ordeal, Frank had never actually met Charles Peterson. The detective had been transferred directly from the hunting cabin to a specialized facility in Atlanta, his recovery from prolonged sedation requiring intensive medical support and therapy. "He wants to thank you in person," Emily added, "and discuss Max's situation." At the mention of his name, the German shepherd's ears perked up. Frank scratched behind them reassuringly, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest at the prospect of potentially losing his new companion. Logically, he understood that Max, or Commander as he'd been known, legally belonged to Peterson or the police department. Emotionally, however, the bond formed through their shared investigation had grown profound. "I'll see him, of course," Frank agreed. "He deserves that much." The following morning, Frank dressed with unusual care, selecting a button-down shirt that concealed his pacemaker scar and the khaki pants Emily had pressed for him. Max seemed to sense the day's significance, remaining unusually close as Frank prepared for their visitor. Detective Mitchell arrived first, helping Peterson from the passenger seat of his unmarked police cruiser. Frank watched through the window as the detective supported his former partner's halting progress up the walkway, the effects of 10 months' captivity evident in Peterson's gaunt frame and unsteady gait. "Charles Peterson," the man introduced himself at the door, extending a trembling hand. Despite his weakened condition, his grip remained firm, his gaze direct and evaluating. "You must be Frank Wilson. I believe we have a mutual friend." As if on cue, Max emerged from behind Frank, his reaction to Peterson immediate and profound. The German shepherd whined with recognition, pressing against the detective's legs with such enthusiasm that Mitchell had to steady Peterson to prevent him from losing balance. "Commander," Peterson whispered, kneeling with difficulty to embrace the dog. "I never thought I'd see you again, boy." The reunion brought unexpected emotion to Frank's throat. He exchanged glances with Mitchell, who nodded subtly, understanding the complicated dynamics at play. Once inside, seated in Frank's living room with coffee Emily had prepared, Peterson studied Frank with open curiosity. "Mitchell's told me everything you did. Taking in Commander, following the evidence, confronting Hawkins." He shook his head in apparent disbelief. "Most people would have walked away." "Most people didn't lose their wife to Hawkins' crimes," Frank replied simply. Peterson nodded, understanding. "I'm sorry about Carol. From what I remember, she was getting close to the same evidence I found. We were supposed to meet, compare notes." His expression darkened. "Then Hawkins moved against her. I didn't connect the dots until it was too late." Frank appreciated the detective's directness. No platitudes or empty condolences, just acknowledgement of shared purpose and loss. "The doctors say my memory will continue improving," Peterson continued, "but some gaps may remain permanent. The cocktail of sedatives they kept me on." He trailed off, hand unconsciously moving to the crook of his arm where needle marks remained visible. "But I remember enough. Enough to testify." "Will that be enough?" Frank asked. "Hawkins has powerful allies, expensive lawyers." "It's never guaranteed," Peterson acknowledged. "But the physical evidence is damning. The EPA has documented over 70 barrels of toxic waste, soil contamination extending well beyond the development site, evidence of deliberate falsification of environmental reports. Whatever happens with the murder charges, the environmental crimes are clear-cut." Frank nodded, having heard similar assessments from the federal prosecutors. The environmental case against Valuetech and Hawkins appeared solid, but murder convictions, especially Carroll's, remained uncertain. Max had positioned himself between the two men, occasionally shifting to maintain contact with both, as if physically connecting these human allies. Peterson noticed, smiling faintly. "He's chosen you," the detective observed. "Commander was always an excellent judge of character." "He's been good company," Frank replied carefully, unwilling to presume upon the detective's clear bond with the dog. "Helped me through some rough patches." Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "Mitchell mentioned you've been taking care of him, training him, continuing his work." He hesitated, seeming to weigh his next words. "I've been medically retired from the force." The department offered to place Commander with another K-9 handler, but he paused, scratching Max behind the ears. "He's not just a police dog. We went through specialized training together for evidence detection, particularly environmental contaminants. It was an experimental program. Only 3 K-9 units nationwide with this specific training." Frank listened, understanding why Max had been so valuable to the investigation, why Hawkins had attempted to eliminate him along with Peterson. "The truth is," Peterson continued, "I'm not in condition to handle him anymore. May never be. My apartment doesn't allow pets, and my treatment plan includes at least 6 more months of residential rehabilitation. Commander deserves better than waiting in departmental kennels." Frank felt Emily's hand on his shoulder, supportive yet cautioning against showing too much hope. "I've spoken with the department," Peterson said finally. "Given the circumstances, they've agreed to an unconventional arrangement. If you're willing, I'd like Commander to stay with you. Officially, not just temporary care, but permanent placement." The offer caught Frank off guard despite his hopes. "Are you sure? Your connection with him is obvious." Peterson nodded, his expression resolute though tinged with sadness. "Sometimes the right decision isn't the easy one. Commander found you for a reason. You two completed the investigation I couldn't finish, exposed crimes I thought would remain buried. There's a bond there that shouldn't be broken." Frank glanced at Max, who was watching this exchange with the intelligent focus characteristic of his breed. "I'd be honored," he said simply. "But I'd want you to remain part of his life. Visit whenever you want." "I'd appreciate that," Peterson replied, relief evident in his expression. "There's paperwork, of course." "The department requires certain agreements about his continued availability for evidence identification if needed for the trial." "Of course." Frank agreed readily. The arrangement felt right, honoring their shared mission while acknowledging the reality of their current circumstances. As they discussed logistics, Mitchell's phone rang. After a brief conversation, he turned to them with a grim expression. That was the prosecutor. The grand jury returned indictments, murder charges for Mercer and Nancy Clark, environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, attempted murder for Peterson's imprisonment. And Carol? Frank asked, though he already anticipated the answer. Mitchell shook his head slightly. Still investigating. They're not closing that avenue, but they're proceeding with the charges they can prove conclusively. The news settled heavily in the room. Frank had prepared himself for this outcome, yet the confirmation still stung. The man responsible for Carol's suffering might never face legal consequences for her death. Peterson leaned forward, meeting Frank's gaze directly. This is how they operate, creating just enough distance, just enough deniability. But we know, Frank. And more importantly, Hawkins knows we know. That's supposed to be enough? Frank asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. No, Peterson acknowledged. It's not enough. But it's not the end either. He reached into his jacket, removing a thumb drive which he placed on the coffee table. This contains everything I collected before they grabbed me. Financial records, witness statements, soil analysis from properties surrounding the development site, including, he added meaningfully, properties where cancer clusters have been identified. Frank stared at the unassuming device, understanding its significance. Civil litigation? Peterson nodded. Criminal charges have a high burden of proof, beyond reasonable doubt. Civil liability requires only preponderance of evidence. The families affected by these toxins deserve compensation, and Valuetech deserves to pay until it hurts. That won't bring Carol back, Frank said quietly. No, Peterson agreed, but it will continue her work. The work that mattered enough for her to risk everything. Emily, who had remained silent during much of this exchange, finally spoke. Mom would have wanted that. She always said individual stories create change where statistics fail. She met Frank's eyes. Remember how she kept folders of personal accounts? How she said numbers don't create empathy, but faces do? Frank nodded, recalling Carol's methodical collection of testimonials from affected communities, the human dimension she insisted brought statistical evidence to life. There's something else, Mitchell interjected, checking his watch. The interim mayor has called a special session tonight. The council is voting on whether to permanently halt the development project and convert the land into a protected watershed area. After the contamination they found, they'd better, Frank responded. It's not that simple, Mitchell explained. Valuetech is offering a remediation plan, capping the contaminated areas, installing monitoring wells, proceeding with modified development. They're leveraging economic arguments, jobs, tax revenue, property values. Half the council seems inclined to accept their proposal. Frank exchanged glances with Peterson, both men recognizing the familiar pattern, corporate interests using financial pressure to override environmental concerns. The session includes public comment, Mitchell added meaningfully. Community voices could sway undecided council members. Frank understood the implication. His story, Carol's story, could influence the vote, potentially preventing future contamination and exposure. Yet public speaking would mean confronting his status as a divisive figure in Oak Ridge, facing hostility from Hawkins' remaining supporters, subjecting himself to stress his doctors had explicitly warned against. Peterson seemed to read his hesitation. Commander could come too, he suggested. His presence tends to focus attention. Frank glanced at Max, who watched him with steady attention. The dog's unwavering loyalty throughout their investigation had been a constant source of strength. Perhaps that strength could extend to this new challenge. What time is the meeting? Frank asked. Decision made. Later that evening, Frank approached the podium at Oak Ridge Town Hall, aware of whispers rippling through the packed chamber. Max walked beside him, a calming presence as Frank faced the council members seated on their elevated platform. Among them, Frank recognized several who had consistently supported Hawkins's initiatives over the years. The interim mayor, a former high school principal named Thomas Grayson, nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Wilson, you have 3 minutes for public comment regarding the proposed remediation and development plan." Frank had prepared notes, but as he stood before the microphone, he set them aside. No prepared statement could convey what needed to be said. "My name is Frank Wilson," he began, his voice steadier than expected. "My wife was Carol Wilson, an investigative journalist who died 2 years ago after experiencing symptoms consistent with toxic exposure. She was investigating illegal waste disposal at what you now call the development site." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. "Many of you knew Carol. She volunteered at the library, taught Sunday school at First Presbyterian, organized the annual food drive. What you may not have known was her dedication to exposing environmental injustice, corporations choosing profit over people's safety." Frank gestured toward the ValueTech representatives seated in the front row. "These gentlemen are proposing to cap contamination their company deliberately created. They're offering monitoring wells after decades of secretly poisoning our groundwater. They're promising jobs while hiding the fact that those jobs come at the cost of our health." Murmurs spread through the audience, some supportive, others hostile. Frank continued, his voice strengthening. "I'm not an environmental scientist or a politician. I'm an engineer who spent 40 years ensuring structures wouldn't fail. And I'm telling you, based on professional experience, that capping contamination in an area with our water table is like putting a Band-Aid on a broken dam." He reached down to stroke Max's head, drawing confidence from the dog's steady presence. "This German Shepherd is specially trained to detect environmental contaminants. He identified toxic barrels buried not just in the designated development area, but throughout the property. The EPA's testing has confirmed contamination extending to the watershed that feeds Oak Ridge Lake, where our children swim, where we fish, where our town gets its drinking water." The council chambers had grown quieter. Attention focused on Frank and Max. Even the ValueTech representatives appeared unsettled. "My wife died believing Oak Ridge deserved the truth. Detective Peterson nearly died collecting evidence of these crimes. Nancy Clark died because she preserved documents proving deliberate falsification of environmental reports." Frank's voice caught momentarily. "The question before you isn't about economic development versus environmental caution. It's about whether we allow those responsible for poisoning our community to determine its future." Frank looked directly at each council member in turn. "The land should be properly decontaminated under EPA supervision and permanently designated as protected watershed. No development, no compromise, no corporation deciding how much poison is acceptable in our children's water." As his allocated time ended, Frank delivered his final thought. Carol believed this community would choose health over hollow promises of prosperity. She believed truth would eventually prevail over profit and political expediency. Tonight, you decide whether she was right about Oak Ridge. Returning to his seat amid a mixture of applause and murmured objections, Frank felt lightheaded, his heart racing despite the pacemaker. Emily squeezed his hand supportively while Mitchell nodded approval from across the aisle. The meeting continued with additional testimony. Environmental experts explaining contamination patterns, medical professionals discussing potential health impacts, ValueTech representatives defending their remediation proposal. Throughout, Frank observed council members' reactions, noting which seemed swayed by testimony and which remained impassive. When the vote finally came shortly before midnight, the outcome reflected Oak Ridge's divided nature. 4 votes against ValueTech's proposal, 3 in favor. The development project was officially terminated, the land to be designated as protected watershed following EPA-supervised decontamination. Outside the council chambers, as supporters congratulated Frank on the outcome, a distinguished older man approached. Robert Chambers, Valuetech's CEO, whom Frank recognized from the confrontation at the construction site. "Mr. Wilson," Chambers acknowledged coldly, "a compelling performance." Emotional appeals often overshadow scientific remediation proposals. Nothing emotional about contamination readings 400 times above legal limits, Frank replied evenly. Chambers smiled thinly. "This isn't over, you understand. Valuetech has significant investments in this community. The economic impacts of tonight's decision will be unfortunate." "Is that a threat?" Mitchell asked, stepping closer. "Merely an observation," Chambers replied smoothly. "Markets respond to regulatory overreach. Jobs disappear. Property values decline. Tax bases erode." His gaze returned to Frank. "Actions have consequences, Mr. Wilson. Perhaps your neighbors will thank you when their children leave Oak Ridge for employment elsewhere." Frank held the executive's gaze. "My wife believes some things matter more than economic indicators: clean water, uncontaminated soil, corporate accountability." "Admirable ideals," Chambers replied dismissively. "I wonder if your neighbors will find them equally comforting when facing foreclosure." With that, he turned and departed, his legal team following in formation. "He's bluffing," Mitchell assured Frank. "Valuetech can't afford more negative publicity. The federal indictments have already tanked their stock value." Frank nodded, though Chambers' implied threat had struck home. Oak Ridge's economy had been struggling for years, with the development project promising revival. By helping stop the project, had he condemned his community to further decline? Emily seemed to read his thoughts. "Dad, you did the right thing. Mom would be proud." As they walked toward the parking lot, Frank's phone rang, an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Mr. Wilson?" A woman's voice, vaguely familiar. "This is Sandra Lipman, Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I interviewed your wife several times before her illness." "Yes?" Frank replied cautiously. "I've been investigating similar cases across the Southeast. Industrial contamination, cover-ups, mysterious illnesses. Your wife was connecting these dots before." She paused delicately. "I believe I've found a pattern implicating not just Valuetech, but several corporations using the same disposal methods, same political fixers, same tactics against whistleblowers." Frank stopped walking, focus sharpening. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Valuetech isn't an isolated case. It's part of a regional pattern, possibly national. Carol recognized it first. I'd like to continue her work, with your help." The reporter's words stirred something in Frank. A sense that Carol's investigation hadn't ended with her death, or even with Hawkins' indictment. It continued, expanding beyond Oak Ridge to other communities, other victims. "I have her research materials," Frank said. "Notes, contacts, sources she protected." "That would be invaluable," Lipman replied, excitement evident in her voice. "This could expose not just individual corporate crimes, but an entire system of environmental abuse and cover-up." As Frank considered the implications, Max pressed against his leg, as if sensing a new mission forming. The dog's presence reminded Frank of Peterson's words earlier. "It's not enough, but it's not the end either." Perhaps this was how Carol's work truly continued, not just through Hawkins' prosecution or the protection of Oak Ridge's watershed, but through expanding the investigation she had begun, connecting her discoveries to a larger pattern of corporate malfeasance. "I'll help," Frank decided. Carol would want her research used to protect other communities. As he ended the call, Frank felt something shift within him. grief giving way to purpose, anger transforming into determination. The journey that had begun with the German Shepherd's damaged collar was expanding, becoming something larger than personal justice. Looking down at Max, whose alert eyes seemed to understand the moment's significance, Frank felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him since Carol's death. The truth she had pursued wasn't confined to Oak Ridge or even to Value Tech. It extended outward, a web of connections waiting to be mapped. "Ready for the next chapter, boy?" Frank asked softly. Max's tail wagged once, decisively. The battle for justice, Carol's justice, wasn't ending. It was evolving. 6 months after the town council's decisive vote against Valuetech's remediation plan, Oak Ridge had settled into an uneasy transition. EPA cleanup crews in hazmat suits had become a common sight around the former development site, methodically excavating contaminated soil and extracting buried waste containers. The promised economic devastation hadn't fully materialized, though the town had weathered some difficult adjustments. Valuetech had closed its regional office, eliminating 37 jobs, and several businesses aligned with Hawkins' interests had relocated to neighboring communities. Frank observed these changes from his front porch, where he spent most mornings with Max, monitoring his strengthening heart and reflecting on the remarkable developments of recent months. The German Shepherd had become a beloved fixture in the neighborhood, children waving as they passed on their way to school, elderly neighbors stopping to offer treats despite Frank's gentle reminders about the dog's strict diet. "Morning, Frank," called Martha Jenkins from across the street, watering her immaculate flower beds. "You two heading to the courthouse today?" Frank nodded, raising his coffee mug in acknowledgement. "Closing arguments. Should be finished by the weekend." The trial of Richard Hawkins had consumed Oak Ridge for 3 weeks, drawing national media attention and dividing the community further. Testimony had revealed decades of environmental violations, systematic bribery of officials, and the deliberate intimidation of whistleblowers. Peterson had provided powerful testimony despite his still evident physical weakness, detailing his investigation and subsequent imprisonment. Frank himself had testified for 2 grueling days, recounting his discovery of Carol's research, his partnership with Max, and the confrontation at the development site where Hawkins had admitted poisoning Carol. The defense had attacked his credibility aggressively, portraying him as a grieving husband driven by misguided vengeance, his cardiac condition causing confusion and false memories. The jury would soon decide whether Hawkins would face consequences for the murders of Jonathan Mercer and Nancy Clark, though the prosecution had been unable to include Carol's death among the charges, the evidence of deliberate poisoning remaining legally insufficient despite Hawkins's recorded confession. Emily emerged from the house, carrying Frank's medication and a light breakfast. At his insistence, she had finally returned to her job in Seattle 3 months earlier, but had flown back for the trial's conclusion. Her presence had been crucial during the most difficult testimony, her steady support helping Frank maintain composure when forced to relive Carol's painful final days. "Peterson called," she reported, settling beside him. "He's meeting us at the courthouse. Says Max should be there for the verdict." Frank nodded, understanding the symbolism. Max had been central to exposing Hawkins' crimes, his specialized training leading to the discovery of crucial evidence, his very existence connecting Peterson's investigation to Frank's. The German Shepherd had become something of a local celebrity, his photo appearing in national newspapers alongside stories about environmental crimes and corporate accountability. "Did you see the latest from the Journal-Constitution?" Emily asked, passing her tablet to Frank. The screen displayed Sandra Lipman's newest article in her ongoing series, Toxic Legacies, which had expanded from Oak Ridge to examine similar patterns of contamination and cover-up across 5 states. Carol's research had provided the foundation, with Frank contributing his late wife's meticulously organized files and protected sources. The collaboration had yielded remarkable results. 3 additional companies under federal investigation, a congressional inquiry into regulatory failures, and a growing movement for stricter enforcement of environmental protections. "They're calling for a federal task force," Emily noted, indicating a passage near the article's conclusion. "Dedicated investigators for environmental crimes with actual enforcement power." "Your mother would have appreciated that," Frank replied, scanning the article with satisfaction. Carol's work was continuing, her impact expanding beyond what she could have imagined. In some ways, that felt more like justice than anything the court might decide today. The drive to the courthouse took them past Oak Ridge Community Hospital, where a newly established environmental health monitoring program was screening residents for exposure-related conditions. The initiative, funded by an emergency public health grant, had already identified concerning patterns of kidney dysfunction, neurological symptoms, and immune disorders among those living closest to the contaminated site. Downtown, the courthouse steps were crowded with protesters holding competing signs. "Justice for Oak Ridge victims," facing off against "Hawkins built this town" across the plaza. News vans lined the street, reporters preparing for the day's proceedings, while camera operators captured the community's visible division. Frank, Emily, and Max made their way through the crowd, receiving both supportive pats on the shoulder and hostile glares. Inside the courthouse, they found Peterson waiting in the designated witness area, his appearance substantially improved since their first meeting. Physical therapy had restored much of his mobility, though he still relied on a cane for longer distances. "Big day," Peterson greeted them, bending to ruffle Max's fur affectionately. The dog responded with evident joy, recognizing his former handler despite their limited contact over the past months. "How are you holding up, Frank?" "Managing," Frank replied honestly. The trial had been more draining than anticipated, reopening grief that had begun to heal and subjecting him to public scrutiny that sometimes bordered on harassment. Hawkins' supporters had made their displeasure known. Anonymous phone calls, occasional vandalism to his property, even an attempted poisoning of Max that had fortunately been thwarted by the dog's training to avoid food from unknown sources. "The prosecution team feels good about the Mercer and Clark charges," Peterson informed them quietly. "The evidence is solid, but they're preparing us for the possibility that some lesser counts might not stick." Frank nodded, having already accepted that complete justice remained elusive. The environmental crimes and obstruction charges were supported by overwhelming evidence, but murder convictions required specific proof of intent that was difficult to establish years after the facts. As they entered the courtroom, Frank caught sight of Hawkins at the defense table. Impeccably dressed as always, his silver hair perfectly styled, his demeanor projecting confidence despite the serious charges against him. The former mayor acknowledged Frank with the slightest nod, a gesture containing neither remorse nor concern, merely recognition of adversaries approaching the conclusion of their contest. The gallery filled quickly, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. The proceedings began with formal precision, the judge's instructions to the jury, followed by the prosecution's closing statement. The lead prosecutor, a veteran federal attorney named Margaret Chen, methodically reviewed the evidence against Hawkins, emphasizing the pattern of deliberate actions taken to silence those who threatened his development plans. "Richard Hawkins didn't commit these crimes in moments of passion or desperation," she told the jury. "He calculated costs and benefits. He weighed human lives against profit margins and political advancement. He determined that Jonathan Mercer, Nancy Clark, and Charles Peterson were acceptable sacrifices for his ambitions." Chen addressed the attempted murder charge regarding Peterson directly. 10 months imprisoned in a remote cabin, deliberately sedated into near vegetation, left with permanent neurological damage, not because Detective Peterson posed any physical threat, but because he possessed information that could expose decades of environmental crimes. The defense closing followed, a carefully constructed narrative portraying Hawkins as a dedicated public servant caught in circumstances beyond his control. His attorney, a nationally recognized defense lawyer whose fees suggested significant backing beyond Hawkins's personal resources, suggested alternative explanations for each piece of evidence, casting doubt on witness testimony and challenging the prosecution's timeline. Most disturbing to Frank was the attorney's characterization of his recorded confession at the development site. A conversation deliberately provoked by Mr. Wilson, an emotionally distraught man with documented cardiac conditions affecting cognition, who brought an aggressive animal onto private property and created a chaotic situation that any reasonable person would attempt to diffuse through appeasement. The blatant distortion of events, transforming Max from trained police K-9 to aggressive animal and recasting Hawkins' cold confession as mere appeasement, sparked murmurs throughout the courtroom. Frank felt Emily's hand tighten around his, a silent reminder to maintain composure despite the provocation. As the defense concluded, the judge provided final instructions to the jury before they retired for deliberations. The bailiff announced that the court would reconvene when a verdict was reached, potentially hours or even days later. Outside the courtroom, Mitchell joined their small group, having attended the proceedings in plain clothes rather than uniform. "Standard strategy," he commented, regarding the defense closing. "Create enough alternate explanations that at least one juror might entertain reasonable doubt." "Will it work?" Emily asked, concern evident in her voice. Mitchell shrugged. "Depends on the jury. The evidence is strong, but Hawkins has supporters in this community. Only takes one holdout to hang a jury on any particular count." Frank absorbed this assessment silently, stroking Max's head as the dog pressed against his leg, sensing his tension. The possibility that Hawkins might escape full accountability had been present throughout the proceedings, yet facing it now brought fresh disappointment. "Whatever happens," Peterson interjected, "what you started has extended far beyond this courtroom. The EPA investigation has expanded to 3 states. The congressional hearings are scheduled for next month. Journalists are connecting dots Carroll first identified." Frank nodded, finding comfort in this perspective. Justice took many forms, not all delivered through verdicts and sentencing. As they discussed next steps, Sandra Lipman approached, recorder in hand. The journalist had covered the trial extensively, her articles contextualizing Oak Ridge's situation within the broader pattern of environmental exploitation she'd been documenting. "Mr. Wilson," she greeted him, "I was hoping for a comment about today's proceedings." Frank hesitated, wary of media attention that often sensationalized his personal story at the expense of broader issues. Lipman had proven more thoughtful than most, however, consistently honoring Carroll's work and focusing on systemic problems rather than individual drama. "The truth is already established," he told her after careful consideration. "The contamination happened. The cover-up happened. People suffered because of deliberate choices made by Value Tech and facilitated by Richard Hawkins. The verdict won't change those facts." Lipman nodded, recording his words. "And Carroll's legacy. How do you see that regardless of today's outcome?" The question touched something deep within Frank, prompting reflection rather than immediate response. After a moment, he replied, "Carroll believed information could create change when enough people understood what was happening in their communities. She saw connections others missed. That work continues through your reporting, through the EPA investigations, through ordinary citizens demanding accountability." "One final question," Lipman pressed. "The Congressional Committee has requested your testimony next month regarding regulatory failures. Will you be attending?" Frank exchanged glances with Emily, whose initial resistance to his continued involvement had gradually transformed into reluctant support as his health stabilized. "Yes," he confirmed. Carol would have wanted her research used to prevent similar situations elsewhere. As Lipman departed, Mitchell received a text message that drew his immediate attention. "The jury's coming back," he announced with evident surprise. "That was fast. Less than 2 hours." The rapid deliberation could indicate either overwhelming consensus or irreconcilable division. Frank felt his heartbeat accelerate despite the pacemaker's regulation, anxiety mounting as they returned to the courtroom. Max pressed closer, his training in detecting human distress evident in his attentive posture. The courtroom filled quickly, tension palpable as the jury filed in. Frank studied their expressions, searching for clues in their carefully neutral faces. Hawkins appeared unperturbed at the defense table, straightening his tie with practiced nonchalance. The judge called the court to order, procedural formalities temporarily suspending the collective breath of the gallery. When the moment finally arrived for the verdict to be read, Frank reached for Emily's hand. "On the count of murder in the first degree in the death of Jonathan Mercer, we find the defendant, Richard Hawkins, guilty." A ripple of reaction swept the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs, a single sob from somewhere behind Frank. He remained perfectly still, absorbing the pronouncement as the clerk continued. "On the count of murder in the second degree in the death of Nancy Clark, we find the defendant, Richard Hawkins, guilty." Emily's grip tightened on his hand, her quiet, "Thank God," barely audible. The environmental crimes counts followed, guilty on all charges. Conspiracy, obstruction of justice, attempted murder regarding Peterson, guilty, guilty, guilty. Only when the final count was read did Frank allow himself to exhale fully. Justice, incomplete but substantial, had been delivered. Hawkins' composed facade finally cracked as the judge ordered him taken into custody pending sentencing, the reality of his situation apparently registering for the first time. As deputies led the former mayor away, he paused briefly, turning to meet Frank's gaze across the courtroom. No words were exchanged, none necessary. The moment contained acknowledgment of a conclusion neither man had anticipated when their paths first crossed, one facing the remainder of his life in federal prison, the other having found purpose in exposing truth Carol had died pursuing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the prosecution team, while demonstrators on both sides reacted to the verdict with predictable emotions. Frank, Emily, Peterson, and Mitchell navigated the chaos with Max leading the way, the German shepherd creating a natural path through the crowd. "Dinner at my place," Frank suggested once they reached relative quiet, to mark the occasion. That evening, seated around Frank's dining table for the first time since the investigation began, they shared a meal that felt like both conclusion and commencement. The conversation flowed easily between reflection on the trial and discussion of next steps. Peterson's continued recovery, Mitchell's promotion to detective sergeant, Emily's tentative plans to spend more time in Oak Ridge despite her Seattle career. "I've been thinking," Emily mentioned as they lingered over coffee. "Mom's environmental journalism deserves recognition beyond news articles. Her methods, her insights about connecting corporate pollution to health outcomes, they should be taught to journalism students, environmental science majors." Frank considered this thoughtfully. "What are you suggesting?" "A foundation," Emily explained, animation entering her voice. "The Carol Wilson Foundation for Environmental Journalism. Scholarships, grants for investigative reporting, resources for communities facing similar situations." The idea resonated immediately. She would have appreciated that approach, Frank agreed. Practical support, rather than just memorializing. "I've saved most of my architecture firm partnership disbursements," Emily continued. "It's enough for initial funding. And with your engineering background, we could include technical support for communities investigating suspected contamination." Peterson leaned forward, clearly intrigued. The department still has the specialized equipment used for Max's training program. It was experimental, never fully implemented. With the right partnerships, that methodology could be expanded. The conversation continued late into the evening, possibilities unfolding as they shared insights from their respective fields. What had begun as a commemoration of justice served gradually transformed into planning for justice extended, Carol's work continuing through new channels, touching communities beyond Oak Ridge. When their guests finally departed, Frank and Emily sat together on the porch, the summer night warm around them. Max lay at Frank's feet, occasionally raising his head to track neighborhood sounds before settling again. "Are you okay?" Emily asked after comfortable silence. "With the verdict, I mean. It didn't include Mom specifically." Frank considered the question carefully. "I've made peace with that aspect," he said finally. "The official record may not reflect what happened to Carol, but the truth is known. Hawkins will die in prison for his other crimes. That's enough." Emily studied him in the porch light, her expression suggesting she wasn't entirely convinced. "And the foundation idea? Is it too soon?" "It's exactly the right time," Frank assured her. Converting grief into action, Carol's specialty. He smiled faintly. She always said mourning should eventually become movement. They sat together a while longer, the conversation turning to practical considerations: Emily's possible relocation to Oak Ridge part-time, Frank's upcoming testimony before Congress, continued collaboration with Sandra Lipman as her investigation expanded. When Emily finally retired for the night, Frank remained on the porch with Max, contemplating the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. From his first encounter with the traumatized German Shepherd at the shelter to today's courtroom victory, each step had seemed both accidental and inevitable, a path he hadn't chosen but had ultimately embraced. His gaze drifted to Carol's garden, where perennials she had planted years ago continued their seasonal cycles without her tending. Emily had maintained the space during her visits, learning the names and needs of each plant from Frank's imperfect recollections of Carol's gardening wisdom. "She would have liked how this turned out," Frank told Max softly. "Not just Hawkins' conviction, but everything that's grown from it. The investigations, the cleanup efforts, the foundation idea. Purpose emerging from loss." Max's ears perked up at Frank's voice, his intelligent eyes fixed on his human companion with evident attention. "Tomorrow we start the next chapter," Frank continued, reaching down to stroke the dog's fur. "Congressional testimony prep, foundation planning. The work continues." As if understanding perfectly, Max rested his head on Frank's knee, a gesture of partnership that had become familiar over their months together. In that quiet moment on the porch, with justice partially served and new purpose established, Frank felt something he had not experienced since Carol's death. Not closure, which suggested an ending, but continuity, which promised a future. The path ahead contained challenges. His health remained fragile despite improvements. Hawkins' allies still wielded influence in Oak Ridge, and the broader fight against environmental exploitation had only begun. Yet for the first time in years, Frank faced these prospects with something resembling hope. Carol's work continued. The truth she valued had emerged, and in the loyal German Shepherd beside him, in his daughter's renewed presence, in the expanding alliance of journalists, scientists, and community advocates, Frank had found a family of purpose that extended beyond blood relations. "We did good, Max," he whispered, gazing at the stars visible above Oak Ridge's modest skyline. "We did good." Max's tail thumped once against the porch boards. Affirmation enough. Frank's journey reminds us that it's never too late to find purpose, even after devastating loss. At 68, when many would retreat into quiet retirement, Frank discovered that his lifetime of skills, engineering precision, attention to detail, and unwavering integrity were exactly what was needed to finish the work his beloved Carol had started. Through partnership with Max, a loyal German shepherd who became both protector and companion, Frank found not just justice, but a renewed sense of meaning that extended beyond personal vindication. His story speaks to all of us who wonder if our best contributions are behind us, showing that sometimes our most important work begins when we least expect it. The Carol Wilson Foundation emerged from grief, transforming personal loss into a legacy that will protect communities for generations. What unexpected purpose have you discovered in your later years? Has a companion animal helped you navigate through difficult times in ways you never anticipated? Please share your stories of finding new meaning, whether through justice, family reconciliation, or unexpected partnerships. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to take that first step toward their own renewed purpose.